In her bedroom the smile left her face, and she stood leaning up against the orchid mauve door and looking at Gay. "Now, tell me," she said, as if she was issuing a command, "all that you can about the crash, about what happened to you when you recovered consciousness, and all that you can remember about everything that went before it," as Gay, sinking into a chair that was pointed out to her, turned rather noticeably white. She continued, "I don't want to harry you, or upset you in any way, but I feel that it is high time someone took charge of your affairs, and really delved into them, for your own sake. Now, is it going to upset you to answer a few very direct questions?" Gay clutched at the arms of the chair, and shook her head slowly. "No, ? But it was plain that the muscles of her throat contracted. "I'll tell you everything I can remember." "Good." Mrs. Lansdowne started to pace up and down, like a slim tiger, over the orchid mauve carpet. "Then, if you can, cast your mind back to the very beginning of your journey to Istanbul, back to the night before you left London, when you had dinner with a man who was very fair, and very pleasant, though perhaps he wouldn't appeal to you." She stood still, and her eyes raked Gay's face mercilessly, like a laboratory assistant waiting for the results to appear on a slide that had just been inserted in a microscope. "Do you remember that man? %T7s the A or AN equals Gay's tongue he's GS moistened her lips. Her head started to ache violently, hammer strokes that caused her to clutch at the arms of her chair. Yes, I do remember. He took you to rather an intimate little restaurant not far from the place where you worked, and you worked in Bond Street, didn't you? And something was entrusted to you. A dress box. Was nothing at all recovered from the wreckage of that aircraft? Did you lose everything you started out with?" When they returned to the room with the silver net curtains and the pink oleanders, Gay was looking not merely white, but exhausted. Her eyes were dark with strain, the pupils slightly distended, and her movements were uncertain. Charles, who had been smoking a cigarette near the window, moved to her quickly, and then his gray eyes narrowed as he put her in a chair and looked upwards at Valerie. "It's perfectly all right," she answered the sharp, unspoken question in those gray eyes rather drawlingly. "Probing is a painful business, but I wanted to help your little friend here, and I think I have helped her. Give her a cigarette," and she passed a cedarwood box to him. "I'll ring for some really strong black coffee." When the coffee arrived, he poured a cup anxiously and handed it to Gay. She tried to smile up at him reassuringly as she accepted the cup, and her pale lips sought to frame the words, "Team all right, I really am," but somehow they wouldn't pass her lips. "Don't fuss, Charles," Mrs. Lansdowne said, surveying him coolly. "Strictly speaking, this is not your affair at all. Young women with difficulties don't normally, rush for assistance to bachelors, even when they happen to be their own countrymen, and I've tried to explain that to Gay here. You're quixotic and generous, and of course you wanted to help, but in future it will be my business to do what I can for Gay." She laughed suddenly, softly, laying a hand on his arm and patting it gently. "Darling, it's really rather funny, because you're not at all the type to be cast for the role of the knight in shining armor, but naturally Gay didn't know that. The sweet innocent says she just picked on you because you were English. I don't think that's very unnatural." Villiers returned a little curtly. Valerie went on stroking his arm, and the cat-like smile of contemplation clung about her mouth. "Never mind, darling, I've got a plan. I think it's an excellent plan, and includes all of us. We simply mustn't offend Orhan Bey, and, after all, why should we, when he's a very respectable man? But if I decide to give a house party at my house in the Taurus Mountains, and invite Gay to join us, then not even the Bey can find reasonable fault with that. And there's a lot that you and I have to discuss about future plans, and we can get together over them. And if Gay likes to make herself useful and do a little secretarial work for me, you can count me out," Charles said, after hesitating for perhaps a bare second while he stared at Gay. "Pimjeving for Paris next week." Mrs. Lansdowne smiled whimsically. "On business, I suppose you could call it business." The whimsical look gave place to a strange, bright gleam in the velvety dark eyes. "Nefacm. Nesakar Kumria TS4AII equals. Then she'll have to wait for you, darling." She slanted the bright look at Gay. "Even Charles isn't proof against the fascination of French women, particularly Parisiennes, and I once knew him so completely captivated by a Berber girl's face that he had it painted." "What happened to the portrait, Charles? Are you going to hang it in Gout dining room when you do eventually settle down?" Charles merely looked at her rather hard, and Gay, who felt like a swimmer returning to the surface, looked bemused. But in the midst of her confusion something registered, and that was a very definite impression that her hostess had claws she was barely concealing, and that she herself was being issued with a warning. It was a warning that amplified one she had already received in the bedroom. She wondered why she had ever thought that Valerie Lansdowne would be a fount of moral support to her. "Don't be silly, Charles," Mrs. Lansdowne said more briskly. "Of course you're going to be one of us. I wouldn't dream of allowing you to fly off to Paris just now. You appealed to me to do something for you, and now that I'm doing it I expect something from you in return." For a moment her eyes were almost glacial, and her lips were thin. "Tomorrow I shall go and see Orhan Bey myself, and in a few days after that we can coax Gay away from him. It would be unwise to rush things. You can leave it to me." "Very well," Charles said, and turned. Gay had another distinct impression that his lips, too, were tight. "Do you feel all right now, my dear?" he asked, more gently. "Because if you do we ought to be getting on our way. I don't want to rush you, but I have a dinner engagement this evening, and I have to return you to your temporary guardian." He seemed to emphasize the word temporary, and a little of her courage, which had been ebbing steadily since lunch, began to return, and she smiled at him gratefully. Mrs. Lansdowne, just before she let them out of the flat, flicked her cheek carelessly with a long, artistic forefinger, and said coolly, "Don't worry, my dear. Everything will turn out well in the end. You'll see." She stood watching until their car disappeared out of the courtyard, under the Byzantine arch, and then she returned to her sitting room and lighted herself a cigarette with an absolutely expressionless pale mask of a face. In the car, as it slid between high walls, in one of the older parts of the town, Gay realized that the shadows of night were already falling, and the blue of the sky was paling before the onset of sunset. The slender shapes of minarets soared upwards into the lightly rose-flushed atmosphere, and in the narrow alleys the shadows were deep and purple, like the bloom on fruit. It was a quiet hour, an hour when the lazy slapping of the Sea of Marmara was a slightly sinister sound, and the first stars were cold and remote, and even in the busy thoroughfares, where people were hastening homewards, filled with plans for the evening ahead, Gay had a feeling of loneliness crowding in upon her, and a terror of being abandoned. The thought of the Bey's house, and Karim, made her want to appeal to the man beside her not to send her home just yet. Suddenly he said, "What was it you wanted to talk to me about?" She remembered that morning she had asked to have a talk with him after they had seen Mrs. Lansdowne, but remembering also something Mrs. Lansdowne had said, in the privacy of her bedroom, she heard herself murmuring falteringly, "It doesn't matter. I mustn't take up your time. You have been very kind, and devoted a lot of time to me today. I mustn't take advantage." "You needn't be afraid of taking advantage," he returned quietly. In fact, his voice was unusually quiet, she thought. "And you were upset this morning. You'd like to tell me about it, wouldn't you, Wheeze? Then will you think I'm being very unconventional if I ask you to come along to my hotel suite? It's the only place I can think of where we can talk, but," and she looked at him quickly sideways, "you have a dinner engagement. There's plenty of time to keep it. You're sure?" "Absolutely sure." Suddenly he looked sideways at her, and she saw his white teeth as he smiled. But, oh, such a different display of perfectly kept teeth from that which Karim had treated her to that morning. And all at once, in the soft gloom of the car, her heart seemed to swell, and her lower lip trembled at the same time. She heard herself saying weakly, gratefully, without even the consent of her own will, and certainly without dwelling upon the advice she had received from Valerie Lansdowne, "You Iris. Oh, Mr. Villiers, I don't know what I'd do without you." She felt his lean brown hand cover both of hers. "Don't you?" She wasn't sure whether it was a laughter note in his voice, or whether it was just a note that was a little odd. "Well, I'm immensely flattered that I'm of some importance to you, and I hope I can message Warmir ls2 jeans go on proving useful, for a while at least." He removed his hand. "But I think you'd better call me Charles. Mr. Villiers is very formal." "Yes, it is, isn't it?" She didn't know quite what she was saying, but she was overwhelmingly conscious of that hand that had given her cold fingers such a comforting pressure resting lightly on the wheel beside her. She felt that she wanted to reach out and snuggle her fingers back inside it again. Only if she did that would everything else cease to matter. All at once she was so confused that she really didn't know what she was saying. "I've always loved the name of Charles." He made no comment. Instead he asked, "And you don't mind risking your reputation for half an hour?" "Not if you can spare half an hour." And then she thought, rather wildly, "But when the half hour was over, what then?" What if Mrs. Lansdowne's influence wasn't strong enough to prevent him from flying off to Paris the following week, and she never saw him again? But there seemed little danger to Gay's reputation when they went up in the lift to Charles's suite. The hotel was very quiet at that hour. It was very tucked away, very exclusive, and very old established. He explained that it was the one he always patronized when he was in Istanbul. The sitting room adjoining his bedroom, which naturally Gay didn't expect to see, was a quiet pool of luxury. He rang the bell, and a waiter received an order to bring drinks. The man never batted an eyelid when Gay turned from staring out through the window at the violet night sky, in which the crescent moon was lifting itself above the rooftops opposite. Anyone more sophisticated than Gay might have thought this an indication that it was by no means an unusual thing for Mr. Villiers to return to his hotel accompanied by an exceptionally attractive young woman. But Gay would never have thought this of Charles. For women, she believed, merely filled a niche in his life, and in any case he was not the type to indulge in promiscuity. "Sit down here," he said, indicating a deep and comfortable settee. He himself seemed to prefer to stand, although his eyes were attracted as if by a magnet to the wonder of soft gold hair that the discreet lighting effects metamorphosed into a spun gold web. "Now, tell me," he ordered quietly, "why you were so upset this morning when I collected you. Why Karim, although he's the one person, apparently who can prove who you are, has thrown you into a panic." She told him, and when her voice died into silence she saw that he was frowning. He started to pace up and down with his head bent, his shoulders bowed, as if this was information that certainly didn't please him. He straightened. "This afternoon, when you had your talk with Valerie, you told her all this." "I imagine I told her all that I have told you, but she is inclined to dismiss Karim as unimportant. She says he is merely a rather foolish young man who spends a great deal of money which his uncle has, up till now, provided him with, and that it is important he should marry a young woman with some substance. Apparently Cecile Maitland would have inherited quite a large sum of money when she was 25. Charles's frown returned. "But your guess is that Karim has already married Cecile, or, rather, that he was married to Cecile at the time of the accident. What of that?" he asked, rather curtly. "What did Valerie think of that?" Gay shrugged her slim shoulders slightly. She was inclined to believe it was just bluff, and if it's bluff we can prove it, of course. In fact, we can prove quite a lot now that Karim has admitted he knows you are not Cecile! "But, yes," she said, looking at him and wondering why his frown was more noticeable than ever. "Don't like the sound of that young man at all." He started to pace up and down again restlessly, as if the proportions of the room were all at once terribly constricting to him. "I don't agree with Valerie that one can dismiss him. Perhaps after we've got him to vouch for your identity, yes. But until he's done that highly important thing the situation is not as free from complications as it was this time yesterday. You are living in the same house with him in the Bay. The Bay is your guardian. But just how effective a guardian ought what? What do you mean?" Gay asked, watching him with a sudden nervous pulse fluttering in her throat, so that her voice sounded wavery. He turned and looked at her. He looked at her so hard that a faint pink flush rose to her cheeks and dyed them until their appearance was almost hectic, and her eyes looked as if they wanted to take refuge behind her long eyelashes. She repeated, at last, "What do you mean?" "I mean," he returned, moving to the settee and dropping down beside her, "that Karim is in an extraordinary position at the moment. He wants to please his uncle, and he wants to get hold of some money. To do both of these things he has only to do one other thing, and that is to marry you." "But I'm not Cecile," she gasped. "Cecile died in the air crash." "Can you prove it?" he asked. "No, but..." Her hand went to her heel. "You said just now that it should be a comparatively simple matter to prove it. If we can get Karim to make his admission, to someone other than you, we can check up on the marriage. Of course, we will certainly do so. But whether or not Cecile Maitland married Karim Anouk, or some friend of Karim Anouk, it still doesn't establish that you are Gay Nicholson, a different person altogether. And until we can get that fact established I don't like the thought of Karim." "Yes?" she inquired quietly. As he knotted his lower lip, he lighted a cigarette and fenced it to her. It was the second time he had done that, and she felt a strange, tremor as the end of the cigarette that had come straight from his lips touched her own. She took a few quick, nervous puffs while he tapped another cigarette on his case. "Listen to me, my dear." He bent towards her, and through the thin film of cigarette smoke his eyes looked very gray. They also looked strangely concerned. "Valerie Lansdowne is a very shrewd woman, but perhaps because she is a woman, and you're a member of her own sex, She didn't see all the dangers of this situation. I don't want to alarm you. And once again his hand was laid over hers, and her fingers itched to clutch at it, for comfort and reassurance, if for no other reason. But your position is vulnerable, to say the least. Without Karim you can't prove who you are, and from his point of view there are possibilities it might be worth his while to examine. And that's why he said he would have to think the matter over, to have allowed you to drag him off this morning to confront his uncle with proof that all these many months you have not been wandering in your mind when you said that you were gay. Nicholson would, or might, have been to deprive himself of an advantage he still don't understand, she said. And then she did understand. She whitened under his eyes. If he married Cecile, and he is anxious to get hold of her money, he could insist that I was the girl he married. She felt his fingers squeeze hers, and suddenly she did start clinging to them. That sounds like something out of an improbable paperback, but he could insist upon that if he liked. Although sooner registered sign or later, of course, the truth would come to light. But it isn't that I'm so much afraid of. In fact, I'm not afraid of that at all. Then what are you afraid of? She whispered. At the present time you are very anxious to prove you are gay, Nicholson. But Karim could alter that. You're so very attractive that, taken together with a generous-sized income, you could prove practically irresistible. His eyes avoided hers. And you're living in the house of the Bey. One could hardly expect the Bey to take sides against his own nephew, even to believe him unscrupulous. Suddenly he freed her fingers and deserted the settee, and once more started pacing up and down. Then he returned to her, and his expression was quite determined. I could take you back to Valerie's flat for tonight, but there's just the possibility that she might disagree with me over this, and I also feel that you've had rather an ordeal today, and I'm not anxious to submit you to another. He smiled at her reassuringly. So I'm going to suggest you stay here for tonight, and I'll take advantage of a friend's offer, and a room that is always ready for me. In the morning I'll see the Bey, or Valerie will see him. But, she gasped, I ain't turn you out of your own rooms. You can. Very easily. His smile had a certain amount of humor in it, but it was also extraordinarily gentle, although she had never seen his mouth look firmer. Look, my dear, I'm not being melodramatic, but quite frankly I wouldn't sleep a wink tonight if you went back to that house where Karim is. From all I've heard of that young man, his mouth set like a trap, and she looked up at him wide-eyed. But the Bey, my things, I haven't even a toothbrush. I can supply that. I can even provide you with pajamas, a pair of my own, if you don't mind sleeping in them. His eyes twinkled just a little. And the hotel management won't think it in the least strange when I tell them you require a room for the night. But couldn't. What about another room? TT wouldn't do, he assured her. This is the better way. She stood up. The situation was so unreal that she could hardly believe it was happening to her, and at the same time she hated to inconvenience him like this. But what about Mrs. Lansdowne? She was convinced that Mrs. Lansdowne would disapprove strongly. She didn't seem to think the matter was very urgent. She's going to call on the Bey tomorrow. T'll ring him tonight, and tell him that you're spending the night with Mrs. Lansdowne. Valerie will have to support me over this tomorrow, but she may not want to do so. In that case we'll have to do without her support. Rather drilly, but she won't withhold it. I can promise you that. For a long moment she stared at him, and she wished she knew why he was so certain of that. At least, she thought she knew, and she wished there was some other reason. He disappeared into his bedroom, and when he returned he was smiling with a glint of amusement. Ve put out some pajamas for you on the bed, and there's a dressing gown over the foot of it. You'll find a new toothbrush in the bathroom. But you, she said concernedly, what about things for yourself? Don't know. Hey, replied Tverbach, an overnight bag for myself. And then the sparkle of amusement in Ria his eyes grew. You'll probably find the pajamas much too large, and the dressing gown will swamp you. The sparkle of amusement faded as he looked down at her. She looked pale and strained, and her eyes were very large, and a trifle dark. Too dark for clear blue eyes. Her mouth looked tremulous, and as vulnerable as he had said she was. She wasn't very tall, and her golden head barely reached to his shoulder. Gay, my dear, you'll be all right, he said, with much more than a ring of earnestness in his voice. I promise you that everything will be completely all right. One day. She swallowed. I don't know why you're doing all this for me, don't you? He moved away, touched a cigarette box on a table, pushed away a bowl of flowers. Then he came back to her, and it struck her that his own eyes were suddenly concerned, but it was a different kind of concern from her own. She felt sure he was asking himself a question, and that for once in his life he had been provided with a riddle to which he could find no clue. He wasn't particularly keen on the riddle, either. "I'm not doing very much," he said. "You're in a curious position." She put out a hand to him, and he took it. "I'll tell them to send you up some dinner. Don't hurry up in the morning. You look as if you need a rest." She found it impossible to articulate anything at all, and she was quite unaware how her eyes were hanging upon his. She was dreading the moment when he would leave her, and she would be alone in his suite, and he would go away with the riddle he couldn't solve worrying him. "Good night, child," he said softly. "No one will worry you here. For er kita uva ues, bead. Apia se pred me may bane acuta soni seger whe:" He took a step away from her. Then he turned back. She felt his arms go round her almost roughly, and her slight body was temporarily crushed up against him. His gray eyes looked almost black as his mouth came down on hers. The kiss settled everything for her. In future there would be no doubts, no chance for any other man to win just such a response as her soft, flower-like mouth yielded willingly, rapturously, to him. But although his lips felt barred and fierce and hungry, and there was a moment when she was sure there would be no limit to the demands he would make of her, the next minute he had let her go, and although he looked pale around the mouth, the shocked look in his eyes was like a douche of cold common sense. "You'll have to forgive me," he said jerkily. "Gay, dear, I apologize. I don't know what came over me. I'm supposed to be protecting you from Kareem." This time he moved determinedly towards the door, and from the door he spoke less jerkily. "Don't worry about anything, and have your breakfast upstairs in your room. Just use the telephone. Good night," he concluded, and shut the door as if it interposed a barrier. He welcomed good night, she returned, although he didn't hear it. "Good night, Charles," and her eyes watched the closed door with something blank and bewildered and hurt in the man. It seemed to Gay that she had hardly closed her eyes before someone was sitting on the end of her bed, and a voice full of the utmost displeasure was telling her that she must get up, and that Mr. Villiers' suite must be vacated without delay. Gay struggled up onto her elbows, and as Charles's pajamas were very much too large for her, and her hair was a glorious golden tangle, she looked very young and appealing, but not to Valerie Lansdowne, the intrepid widow, immaculate in tusse or silk of a pale lavender shade, with a wide-brimmed white hat, white gloves and handbag, and a face that was white with annoyance, declared that this was a situation that actually horrified her. "I'm not narrow-minded, and in the course of my life I have had to do unconventional things, extremely unconventional things on occasion, but at your age I didn't borrow a man's pajamas, and sleep in his bed in a place like Istanbul. In Paris, very likely, no one would take any notice. In London you could probably get away with it, but here, where everyone regards you as Orhan Bey's ward, what do you think people are going to say? What do you think I am going to say to the Bey when I visit him today on your behalf?" Gay stumbled out of bed and covered Charles's pajamas with Charles's dressing gown. The sight of that dressing gown, of paisley silk, but essentially masculine, hugged closely to the younger woman's slender body, seemed to add fuel to the fire of Valerie's anger, and her white teeth actually tore for a moment at her lower lip. "M2, Nate Ifee na go and get dressed," she ordered. "Take your things into the bathroom, and I'll tidy up this room. It's no use trying to keep things from the servants here, because the whole place is probably buzzing with the story that you spent the night here. But there's no need to leave the room littered with evidences of feminine occupation." She removed her own handkerchief from her handbag and dusted the powder from the dressing table. "I'll be waiting for you in the sitting room when you're presentable. Pve already told Charles over the telephone what I think of this nonsense, and he should be here, too, within the half hour." For a moment Gay stood staring at her after these cold commands had died away, and a little flame of anger that rose up in her all but resulted in a short but indignant speech of her own. But there was something about the deadly whiteness of Mrs. Lansdowne's no longer young-looking face. This morning she could have been 40, and the snake-like venom in her eyes, that repelled and silenced. For the first time in her life Gay felt that a stronger personality than her own was prepared to take her and mold her entirely to her own will. And but for the fact that Gay was a woman, and not one of the creatures she had often hunted, Valerie would do something ruthless to this girl who had affronted her, who had, indeed, infuriated her, long before Gay was ready, and in spite of her frantic hurry, it seemed that she made little real speed with her dressing. She heard voices in the sitting room, Charles's voice, with a note of steel in it, a note that she herself had never heard before, and the high, reproving voice of Valerie Lansdowne. When she entered the sitting room they were standing facing one another, and in spite of her agitation the thought leapt through her mind that they were a superbly matched pair, both lithe and vital, dark and determined. They were neither of them accustomed to being dictated to, and Charles's smooth bronze face had a dull glow of red below the cheekbones. He turned immediately Gay entered the room. "Good morning, Gay," he said curtly. "I hope you slept well." "She slept very well indeed. I have no doubt at all," Mrs. Lansdowne answered for her, with her lower lip curling. "But she would have slept just as well in her own bed, or even one of my beds, and with less comment from other people. As it is, the sooner we get her out of Istanbul now the better." "Did you sleep well, Gay?" Charles asked, looking at her as if the other woman hadn't spoken. She nodded. She was feeling dull and confused, a little trembly inside. "Thank you. I slept very well. And you've had some breakfast?" This time she shook her head. "But it doesn't matter. I don't want any, Anne." But he walked to the telephone and lifted it, and spoke to room service. "And you can send up coffee for 3 people, he added. He looked through narrowed, steel gray eyes at Valerie. "Since you're up and about so early I don't suppose you waited for breakfast, either." At that her anger positively bubbled over. "I can't understand you, Charles," she said. "You, a man of the world, not an ignoramus like this stupid girl here. She's had no experience of life. She apparently doesn't understand that there are some things that are just not done, not because of principles, or narrow views that other people unfortunately hold, but because they just are not done. You can't live in a conventional world and behave unconventionally. Do you suppose the Bey is going to look contentedly on the idea of Gay's marrying his nephew now, after she's spent a night in your hotel room? It won't matter to him that you were spending the night with a friend. I told him over the telephone that she was spending the night with you." Charles returned evenly. "Anne, in any case, as Gay is not marrying his nephew it won't greatly matter what the Bey thinks. He is her natural guardian, legal guardian at the moment. That will very soon be put right." "You sound very optimistic." "I am not nearly so optimistic. And for many reasons I think Gay would be wise if she married Karim. There is no question of her marrying Karim after last night. The Bey might even insist on marrying her off to someone. In that case," Charles replied, and too late she realized how unwise she had been. "I am the obvious one for him to pick upon." She caught her breath. The 2 spots of angry color on her somewhat pronounced cheekbones died with a rapidity that was rather like the night closing down on the day in that particular hemisphere. And then she laughed shakily. "Charles, there's no need to turn the matter into a joke," she protested. "I don't suppose poor Gay feels up to jokes this morning, do you, my dear?" Looking at Gay with such a miraculous softening of her expression that the Jatter wondered how it had been achieved. One moment the slow black eyes were glittering with enmity, and a kind of baffled fury, directed even against a man on whom her designs were fixed, or so the younger woman was certain. And then, by some extraordinary miracle, the enmity had vanished, and the fury had given place to a gentle derisive humor. It was an alteration of moods that was very nearly unbelievable. "I was not joking," Charles said, and Gay found it necessary to clutch at the arm of a chair. Then there was a tap at the door, and the waiter entered with a tray of coffee and rolls. Mrs. Lansdowne suddenly discovered that she was simply dying for some coffee, and she was quite certain that Gay was, too. She sat down in front of the tray and started to pour out, handling the old-fashioned silver coffee pot in a manner that drew attention to the whiteness of her hands, with their blood-red fingernails, and her air of affability and good temper was so striking that the other 2 could have wondered whether the scene of a few moments before had actually taken place. But Charles's expression remained the same as he accepted his cup from those perfect hands that were a little like delicate claws if one allowed oneself to think along such lines. "Anne, indeed." He looked a trifle grim as he stared down into the cup without tasting the coffee. Gay, unable to do anything about a strange trembling that was going on deep inside her, found that her cup rattled in her saucer as she attempted to take a few nervous sips. "Now," Mrs. Lansdowne said, speaking with the utmost calm, when another minute or so had passed, "we shall get nowhere at all if we lose a sense of proportion about this matter. I'll admit, Charles, that I did think you were very unwise when I first heard that you had allowed Gay to remain here in your suite. But I feel sure that you acted as you did only in Gay's interests, or what you thought were her best interests." She smiled at him with great and calculated charm. "If you had consulted me I would have advised you strongly against doing anything at all that would be likely to involve Gay in an unconventional situation. But now that the thing has happened it's no use crying over spilt milk. To you it seemed wiser that Gay should not return to the Bey's house last night, and maybe you were right. I am not going to argue about that anymore, but the important thing we have to decide is, what do we do next? Whatever we do next. Gay is not returning to the base house, Charles said, with an inflexible determination in his voice. Valerie Lansdowne retained her unruffled expression. Very well, then we shall have to put forward our plans a little. My flat is not large enough for Gay to stay with me for any length of time, and in any case it will be better to get her away from Istanbul as quickly as possible. I suggest that we leave for the Taurus Mountains immediately. Charles looked at her thoughtfully. Is that quite convenient for you? T's not in the least convenient, she assured him with resignation, but I am prepared to sacrifice my convenience for the moment, and you, Charles, will have to sacrifice your trip to Paris, or postpone it for a while. He nodded. It wasn't all that important, and I have other plans on hand which need not be altogether neglected. But first I shall see the Bey. You will see the Bey, yes, and tell him everything, everything his nephew has admitted to, and has admitted that Gay isn't Cecile Maitland, which is important. Valerie crushed out a cigarette in an ashtray, and then accepted another from his case. I still think it might be wiser if you allowed me to see the Bey, and at this stage I don't see very much point in antagonizing Karim. That young man could be quite a menace to every aspect of Gay's future, if he is handled unwisely at this particular juncture, she pointed out. My methods would be subtler, but I venture to predict that they would lead somewhere quite satisfactory in the end. And the end is not good enough, Charles returned, with a stubbornness that made his chin seem all at once to be hewn out of granite, while his eyes looked bleak. And, in any case, it was a stubbornness she had never encountered in him before. Not quite this form of stubbornness. It is Gay's present that is menaced by what is going on, and it's useless to waste subtlety on a type like Karim. I shall see the Bey as soon as I can get myself admitted to his house this morning. Very well, Valerie said again. Her eyes looked long and slightly slanting, and in the growing light of day her face had a distinctly Mongolian cast. But don't commit yourself to anything foolish, Charles, she warned suddenly. Don't allow your sympathy for Gay, which, incidentally, I share, to carry you away. The warning was sharp and unmistakable. He turned and looked at her, then he turned back to Gay. His smile, as he put out his hand, was like something plucking at her heartstrings. Plus don't worry, my dear, he said gently, very gently, because her face looked pale and bemused. This is a most peculiar period you're living through, but you will live through it. The day will dawn when everything will be completely normal and rational again. You'll see, she nodded, not trusting herself to answer him. Chin up, he advised, squeezing her fingers. Tptala ra tt pesoaeesans, I vat I. And in order not to waste any time, the watchful Mrs. Lansdowne put in, as a curious quiver passed across Gay's small chin, and her eye seemed to cling almost desperately to the man's face. We will go back to my flat and do some packing for the journey, and I suggest we leave about sunset. You can drive through the night, Charles, and we can stop somewhere for breakfast, and then go on. It is better that way than driving in the heat for hours on end. Charles agreed with her, and added that of course he would be driving his own car. You will have Mustafa to drive you, I expect? You won't be leaving him behind. As a matter of fact, I will be leaving him behind, she replied, coolly. I am expecting friends, or, rather, one particular friend, to arrive in Istanbul within the next few days, and he and one other friend will be joining us later on. Messias will have to be left behind to drive them in my car. Charles looked a little curious. Do I know this particular friend? No, darling, you don't. She touched his face caressingly, familiarly. He is no one you have met so far, but you will be meeting him soon, and so will Gay. Her eyes went, lynx-like, to Gay's face, and then smiled. T said we'd have a house party, didn't I? When Charles had departed, after observing that he hoped the house party would be kept within strict limits, because Dottie was not the type to favor house parties at any time, the widow directed another rather curious smile at Gay. Dear Charles, she said, he likes the wide open spaces of the earth, the lonely spaces, where there are no women to disturb him, and only past civilizations to preoccupy him. She will be a clever woman who will woo 73 on CTIDAEI for him away from things that mean his life, and once she has wooed him away, she will almost certainly never keep him. Charles would stifle in a domestic atmosphere. The marriage couldn't last. Even I would never put shackles on Charles, and that's why we have remained such good friends for so long. He knows that whatever designs I may have upon him, they are in his own best interests. Pro me, he will never lose his freedom, and like a horse to the waterhole that never fails, he returns to Mel as that same quiver passed across Gay's face that had passed across it before. Mrs. Lansdowne's smile grew gently amused, and just for an instant, it was vicious. Come along, she said. There is a great deal to be done, and you will have to help me. If life in the base house has made you soft, we will harden you up by degrees. The vicious phase passed. We shall probably become quite good friends after we have known one another a while, she remarked as they went down in the lift. She surveyed Gay speculatively. I may even find a job for you. Anything I can do to repay your kindness I will, Gay returned, a little stiffly, for she had the distinct impression that she was being baited. Good, Mrs. Lansdowne exclaimed gaily. If you can do secretarial work, you can help me with my new book. Charles is going to help me with that, too. He and I have shared so many experiences which we will find it pleasant to recall, and my house in the mountains is very remote. I share Charles's partiality for the lonely places. It will be an excellent spot in which to work. An excellent spot, I think, for many things. Bray. Her look still dwelt consideringly on Gay as the lift gates clanged open, and just for an instant, as the blue and gold of a morning on the shores of the Bosporus welcomed them, the unsullied blue and gold that was, blended with the scents of opening shrubs, the salty breath of the Marmara, the spicy scents from the hotel kitchens. The younger woman wondered why she didn't act upon an impulse and slip away and become lost in it. It was an impulse that was so strong before she decided to ignore it that she was trembling, as from some sort of a reaction, as she took her place in Mrs. Lansdowne's car, and Mrs. Lansdowne herself piloted it away from the front of the hotel, and as it moved away from the edge of the curb, Gay knew that it was too late to do something that a panic-stricken moment had urged her to do, and even as she lay back against the superbly comfortable upholstery, she could not have explained that moment of sheer, unadulterated panic, or the violent need to escape that had come upon her. Escape not merely from something menacing in the future, but a whole lifetime, possibly, of unhappiness. They drove all through the night, and for breakfast they stopped at a clean little inn where the freshness of mountain air was already invigorating, and a pleasant change after the heat of Istanbul. Full stop. Gay found herself shivering as she stepped from the car, and because she had slept intermittently throughout the night, she felt dazed by the brightness and clearness of the light. The back of Charles Villiers' big, roomy car was sufficiently comfortable to make dozing inevitable when one was traveling hour after hour through a velvet wall of darkness, and as she had had no one on the seat beside her, there had been no one to prod her into a state of wakefulness when the dawn at last broke. Mrs. Lansdowne had sat beside Charles at the wheel, and now she was looking as fresh as if they had only just started off, with a cigarette between her lips, and her sleek hair unruffled. She looked at Gay just a shade contemptuously as the girl stumbled out onto the uneven cobbles in front of the inn. "Tf, you'd done as much traveling in your life as I have. You'd realize that there are moments to keep awake, and moments to sleep," she said, indicating the strange new world about them. Her eyes seemed to glow. "This is better than all your towns. Better even than Paris," looking round meaningly into Charles's grey eyes. He looked back at her with as much alertness in those eyes as was in her own, and that in spite of the fact that he had declined to permit her to take turn and turn about with him at the wheel during the night, and for an instant a rather cold smile answered the challenging gleam in hers. Then he put out a hand to steady Gay as she, stood looking about her almost wonderingly, as if she could hardly believe in the metamorphosis that had occurred while she slept. The conclusion of Valerie's satisfied speech had passed her by, but she did agree with her that there were moments when one should make every attempt to keep awake. She would have given anything now to have seen this wild country break through the first of the light, the snow-crested peaks soaring above them making the valleys seem so far away and remote. They were valleys filled with fir trees, and there were stupendous drops and ravines and savage gorges, and the rosy-tinted sunlight was discovering millions of diamonds in a fast-flowing cascade that tumbled from rock to rock down the mountainside. The inn stood well back from the road, which was the color of Devon soil, and with that riot of color in the sky, like a lot of flamingos' wings palpitating in the sharp, cool air scented with fir, Gay felt as if a deliberate assault was being made on her eyeballs by a solid mass of color, and that she was utterly unprepared for it. Valerie Lansdowne gave her a careless smile, and moved towards the inn. "We'll have a wash and a before breakfast," she said. It's lucky for you that Charles managed to persuade the Bey to let him have a few of your clothes. Otherwise you wouldn't have a thing to change into." This was so true that Gay sent Charles a somewhat uncertain, but defiantly grateful smile, and he patted her on the shoulder encouragingly. The night before there had been no opportunity for him to explain exactly what had happened when he visited the Bey, for Valerie had been full of bustle over the actual getting away, and mind that her last-minute instructions to Mustafa, who, nor Rie was let behind, could in no circumstances be misunderstood. She had said impatiently that explanations could wait until they were well on their way, and the only thing Gay knew so far was that the Bey had sent her a note which had surprised her, for in it he stated with obvious sincerity that he would look forward to her return, and that his house would be a refuge for her at all times. At all times. She looked about her at the lonely mountain road, and the plains dropping away below them, and felt very far from Istanbul, and suddenly disturbed because the Bey had really been a very good friend to her, and she had broken away from his refuge in her wild desire to be free, if, indeed, it ever had been a refuge. To her it had seemed like a trap that had claimed her, but perhaps there were other forms of traps. Come along, Mrs. Lansdowne urged with impatience, as Gay's uncertainty showed clearly in her expression, and her cramped feet made her movements a little awkward. "We still have a considerable distance to travel, and I don't want to waste more than half an hour or so here." "All in good time," Charles said quietly, as he handed Gay one of the lightest of her suitcases before she disappeared up into the small, dark bedroom that was to be hers for such a very short while. "Everything will be explained to you as soon as we have the opportunity, and in the meantime you have the Bey's letter. If it's any comfort to you, your boats are not yet entirely burned," and he smiled at her a little oddly, or so she thought. The breakfast was good, or, rather, the coffee was excellent and refreshing, and the eggs, cooked according to instructions issued very explicitly by Mrs. Lansdowne, quite eatable. Then they were on their way again, and now, at last, Gay was able to take in every detail of the scenery. She still sat alone on the back seat, but the blouse of her suit was clean and crisp, her hair shone in the sunlight, and her eyes were brighter and more appreciative than they had been for weeks. She knew that she was seeing the real Turkey for the first time, the Turkey that had nothing to do with cities, and it was far more primitive than she had imagined. Sometimes the road was so desolate that it was almost frightening, especially when far down on the plain she saw a string of camels moving as they had moved for centuries over the flat brown earth. When they drew near to the outskirts of little sun-baked towns, the first thing that came in sight was the minaret of a mosque, and then more camels came filing out to meet them. The townspeople wore the European dress that is used all over Turkey in these days, but in the villages on the high plateaus there were goatherds who wore thick fur caps and sheepskin jackets, and although they sometimes ran into a posse of policemen, or more frequently soldiers in drab putty-colored uniforms, like the rocks around them, they just as frequently encountered a lonely tribesman, with mahogany face and wild hair, wearing a weird assortment of garments, who might have belonged to the days of Genghis Khan, except that he was usually clutching a rifle. The longer they drove, and the wilder grew the scenery, the more was Gay impressed with the belief that she had said goodbye to civilization, at least for the time being. And although there was something exciting about this lonely region, there was also, as the hours went by, a feeling of uneasiness that mounted in her. Valerie Lansdowne, as the big car sped on its way, handled so expertly by Charles Villiers that the twists, and turns of the difficult road afforded them little actual discomfort, seemed to become more alive, and even to throw off the few remnants of ill humor that had clung to her since they left Istanbul. It was just as if, Gay thought, watching her sometimes very closely from behind, civilization had a hampering effect on her spirits, whereas those spirits rose and soared like the flight of an eagle in a region where they might have been traveling backwards in time. There was something almost exultant in her eyes as she looked about her, and to Charles she exclaimed occasionally when sights and scenes beside the road struck her as worthy of a burst of excitement. "Wait until you see my house, Charles, darling," she said to him once. Most of her conversation was addressed directly to the man, as if the girl on the back seat didn't exist. "I think you'll be both pleased and surprised. I bought it a few years ago from a man who loved feeling he was completely cut off from people he didn't want to know, just as I do at times, and I've spent quite a lot of money on it since then, improving it. It was originally merely a huddle of buildings grouped in a sort of con, but today most of it is modernized." She turned glistening black eyes upon him. When anything is important to me, I don't spare expense. And luckily I never have to bother about such a hampering thing as expense. Which means you must be a very rich woman. Valerie, my dear, Charles returned, his eyes on the road ahead. But although his voice was mild and politely interested, his eyes, which she couldn't see, were alert and quizzical. Do you owe all this superabundance of wealth to the late Mr. Lansdowne, who unfortunately had to leave it, and you, behind? Her red-lipped smile glimmered with amusement. I do, she admitted, although my father left me a lot of money also. But I don't mind admitting that I married for material reasons. The second time I shall not make that mistake. Was it a mistake? In a way. But there are many things I've been able to do that I would not have been able to consider for one moment without so much substance behind me. And without my first marriage, a second marriage for more satisfactory reasons would not have such an excellent chance of success, would it? Not if you think a superabundance of wealth is necessary for the success of any marriage, Charles returned, much more drily this time. In the back of the car Gay tensed, and New thought, feeling uncomfortable about it, that she was listening. Darling, have you a superabundance of wealth? Valerie inquired, lighting a cigarette from his case, which she extracted from his pocket with nimble fingers. You seem to do most of the things you want to do, and so far as I know you don't have to work for such a vulgar thing as a livelihood. But there must be things you would like to do, things that require a great deal of cash, such as expeditions too costly even to contemplate, under present circumstances, but which are secret dreams of yours. Isn't that so, Charles? He frowned at the tortuous road ahead. Have you ever known anyone with my hobby rich enough to realize all his secret dreams? He demanded brusquely. She smiled again. No, darling, that's what I meant when I said there must be something you would still like to do, and which, being the man you are, you ought to do. It's hateful to have to beg funds just because you would like to prove to the world that there are certain corners of the earth where civilizations flourished long before the meaning of the word was understood, where you know you can make discoveries that would delight your whole soul if. But there is still that if, even with you, isn't there, Charles? This time he didn't answer, and she lay back gracefully in her corner and nestled her head against the pale gray upholstery. When she spoke again, she seemed to be doing so with deliberate dreaminess. I have plans, Charles, and I'll tell you all about them before you leave my house. We'll go into the matter thoroughly, and I promise you that at least I shall be able to tempt you. They flashed through a town where the shadows seemed to be falling thickly already, although it was still only late afternoon, and a string of horsemen coming in from the desert spaces watched the big powerful car as it streaked on its way with a kind of awe on their brown, dusty faces. Then, after a last steep ascent, and with the mountains frowning upon them and shutting out the light, they nosed between a pair of immensely thick gates that opened at their approach. And, once inside the gates, Gay could see that they were in the high-walled con Valerie had spoken about. But it was nowadays merely an outer courtyard to what lay at the heart and core of it. And once they had penetrated through a series of other gateways to that heart, she wondered whether she had been suddenly bewitched. For a white, modern house was surrounded by masses of color that were unmistakably flower beds, and a long veranda dotted with deliciously comfortable-looking rattan chairs, and little tables, was supported by pillars that were simply wreathed with a blaze of flamboyant growth. She could see the flat roof from which, at that hour of the day, with the sun sinking sharply behind some shoulder of the mountains, the riot of color in the sky would still be visible, and the stars, as soon as they appeared, would be magical. She had a sensation of being hemmed in by wall after wall that protected, like a stout casket, this delicate toy of a house, and from somewhere not far away she caught the tinkling of a fountain, and above it a more discordant note of dogs barking, and above the barking of the dogs there was another sound she found it quite impossible to define. The glass doors of the house opened, and light streamed forth across the veranda, banishing the last illusion of daylight. A woman, young but prim, in a dark dress, the sort of young woman who might be in charge of a workroom of busy midinettes in a Paris dress house, emerged and greeted the owner of the house. She spoke in French, but without any of the vivacity of a true Frenchwoman. You are a little earlier than we expected, madam, but the house is ready. The house is always ready. That's more or less as I expected. Marie, Mrs. Lansdowne returned, with great coolness. Then she turned to Gay and introduced her. This is Miss Nicholson. She is going to act as my secretary for a few weeks. As nothing had been definitely said about her remaining for a few weeks, and the suggestion that you tittertook a few secretarial duties had only so far been a suggestion. Gay was a little surprised by this definite statement of her status. Then she saw the smile that glimmered in a dark eyes as Charles was presented. "This is Mr. Villiers, my guest." Marie bent a neck that seemed remarkably stiff. "Bonsoir, monsieur," she murmured. And then, as an afterthought, "Bonsoir, mademoiselle, take Miss Nicholson to her room." "Marie," Mrs. Lansdowne instructed. "And bring drinks to the lounge," she added. Full stop. Gay felt as if a hot flush sped up and down her spine, realizing that she was being dismissed. And as she followed the dark, amazingly trim figure of Marie into the by now brightly lighted house, she had the feeling that Charles's eyes watched her go, and that there was a tiny frown between his brows. Chapter 10. Marie ushered her into a bedroom that was as sumptuous as any she had ever slept in. Even in the